They had been told the Japanese would come at night. The air over Guadalcanal was thick enough to taste, a sour mix of jungle rot, cordite, and the faint metallic tang from the lagoon. Somewhere behind the tree line, Henderson Field slept under its ragged line of foxholes and wire, the one strip of scraped earth that justified every man in the 1st Marine Division being here. But down along the little river the maps called the Ilu, and the Marines called the Tenaru, nobody was sleeping. Al Schmid lay on his belly in the shallow gun pit, elbows in damp sand, cheek against the cool steel of a Browning M1917A1. Water jacket, tripod legs, ammo boxes stacked like bricks. They filled the narrow firing line in front of him. The gun's feed cover was up, belt threaded, first round snug against the feed pawl. In the dark, he ran fingers over it by habit. Smooth brass, rim set right. No twist in the cloth. To his left, PFC Johnny Rivers muttered around a cigarette butt that wasn't lit. "Quit fidgeting, Schmid. She's ready." "I'd rather fidget now than fix a jam later," Al said. His voice was soft. Philadelphia flattened into something the whole platoon could understand. Behind them, Corporal Leroy Diamond shifted his weight, the slow creak of webbing and canteen metal. He was the one who knew this ground best, the one who'd walked the line with maps and engineers and officers, pointing to where the guns should go. Now his eyes were on the black strip of river and the darker wall of jungle beyond. "Check your traverse," Diamond said quietly. Al swung the Browning through its left and right limits, feeling the resistance at the stops, counting seconds. 1, 2, 3. Back the other way. 1, 2, 3. The arc covered the sandbar, the crossing point, the far bank. The idea was simple, the way good machine gun work always was. If anyone tried to step into the strip of beach in front of them, they'd step into a storm. He thought of the training back in the States. Sand tables, chalkboards, sergeants with sticks, talking about beaten zones and grazing fire as if they were abstract concepts, lines on diagrams. Out here, it was a strip of sand 30 yards wide, and whatever stepped onto it was either friend or foe, life or death. Somewhere up the line, a flare went up, a streak of orange climbing into the sky like it had changed its mind halfway and wanted to fall back. For a second, it turned the world silver. Palm fronds, wire, the river glinting like metal, and then died, leaving the darkness thicker than before. "Contacts?" Rivers asked. "Probably some Jap patrol testing us," Diamond said. "They want to see where we shoot from. We're not going to be polite and show them." The Japanese had been out there for days. Everyone knew that. Recon reports said a detachment had landed southeast, more than 1,000 men, veterans of earlier campaigns, ordered to throw the Marines into the sea. Around the gun pits, the talk was always the same. "They think we're a few hundred engineers guarding an airfield. They don't know there's a whole Marine division dug in here." They laughed when they said it, but it wasn't the usual kind of laughter. It was tight and short, like letting off steam from a valve that had to hold. Al listened to the night. Crickets, the slow wash of the sea somewhere to his right, the small sounds a jungle makes when it's trying to sound like nothing at all. Every so often a mortar coughed from the Marine side, a lazy arc toward the far bank they couldn't see. Otherwise, it was just waiting. He tried not to think about time. Hours out here were strange things, too long and too short at the same time. When he let his mind slip, it went back home. The steel mill, sparks showering off hot metal, foremen calling over the din, the heavy rhythm of presses. There was a sameness to it that comforted him. Steel, heat, noise. Here it was steel, heat, noise of another kind. "Quit drifting," Diamond said, as if he'd felt the thought drift away from the gun. "This is when they like to come. Tired men blink slow." "I'm awake," Al said. "Good, stay that way." The impossible thing, though, wasn't that the Japanese might attack tonight. That was expected. Everyone in H Company knew something big was coming. What no one could have reasonably swallowed if told the day before was that before dawn, a man from Philadelphia who'd spent his life cutting steel would be sitting behind this gun, blind and bleeding, and still pouring fire into a river he could no longer see, while bodies stacked in front of him in numbers that didn't make sense. He didn't know that yet. He just knew the gun felt right under his hands, and the river smelled wrong. The first real hint came as a tremor, not in the ground, but in the air, an almost inaudible vibration, like something far off had exhaled. Al lifted his head slightly. The jungle line across the water was a darker band on a dark background, but now there were sounds within it that didn't belong to birds or insects. Branches brushed by something heavy, a muffled clink of metal, whispers in a language he didn't understand, but had come to recognize. Rivers spat the dead cigarette out. "Hear that?" Diamond didn't answer right away. Then, "They're forming up." A moment later, the flare streaked up again, this time from somewhere deeper in the marine lines, and this time the timing was terrible and perfect all at once. It lit the whole curve of the Ilu River like a stage, and on that stage, across the narrow water, shapes were moving. Lots of them. Packed together, hunched, dark helmets and rifles and bayonets glinting. For one stalled heartbeat, nobody in the pit moved. The scale of it killed every small conversation in their heads. Then Diamond spoke, his voice suddenly sharp. "Rivers, fire when you're ready. Schmid, feed and watch for jams. We're about to earn our pay." The flare started to fall. Rivers slapped the feed cover down, palms solid against steel. "Ready. Take them," Diamond said. The first bursts from the Browning were almost delicate, 3-round pulses, the sound lost inside the sudden roar that erupted up and down the line as other guns and rifles joined in. But delicate or not, the rounds walked across the sandbar where the Japanese had begun to move, cutting little spurts of sand, then dark shapes. Men who had stepped forward with rehearsed precision suddenly folded, dropped, jerked sideways. Al felt the gun buck under River's grip, the cloth belt sliding over his hand, each cartridge case jumping into the night. The water jacket vibrated, already beginning to warm. His world narrowed to the smooth pull of the belt, the feel of brass, the need to keep the feed steady. He didn't have time to think about what was happening across the river. His job was to keep the Browning alive and running, like feeding a furnace that had to stay hot, or something bigger went cold. He thought of how sure the other side must have been when they stepped off. Somewhere over there was a Japanese officer who'd been told that Henderson Field was lightly guarded, that American morale was brittle, that these Marines were not the kind of enemy they'd faced in China or Malaya. That officer had walked into the jungle wrapped in a belief that the Empire's will could carry his men across any strip of sand. Now his men were stepping into a fight that didn't match anything in their orders. As the flare died and darkness crashed down again, the tracers from the Browning drew their own brief lines, sketching a geometry of death no planning staff had drawn on a map. The night filled with screaming and the heavy, unbroken rhythm of the gun, its stutter climbing toward something that felt less like combat and more like an industrial process. There were 800 Japanese in that detachment. By morning, nearly all of them would be dead or wounded. Before any of them had fired a shot tonight, they believed that was impossible. They had reasons for believing it. Those reasons had been built over years, in another time and place, away from the Ilu's muddy water. That belief had made sense. In the fluorescent glare of a planning room far from the smell of jungle mud, the numbers on the map had looked clean. On the wall, charts showed known enemy positions, a perimeter around an airfield carved out of kunai grass by American engineers barely 2 weeks before, some rifle pits, a handful of guns. Reports suggested that the men guarding it were tired, undersupplied, perhaps even sick. They were, as several briefings put it, a scratch force. A few naval infantry, perhaps. Engineers, not assault troops. Men used to shovels and bulldozers, not bayonets and machine guns. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki studied those charts with the kind of concentration that had carried him up the ladder of the Imperial Japanese Army. He was not a fool. In China, he had seen what happened to officers who trusted paper too much. But he also trusted something else. The patterns built into his life since he'd been a young cadet. The Empire had advanced across Asia and the Pacific because, time and again, Japanese troops had faced Western soldiers in the field and broken them. They had done it at night, with bayonet charges and close-quarter fighting, with a spirit that staff colleges translated into phrases like offensive elan. The phrase that echoed up and down the ranks had fewer syllables but more weight. Seishin. Spirit. Now his detachment, men trained, hardened, proud, had been given a clear mission. Land on the shores near Guadalcanal. Move inland. Attack the American perimeter. Smash it. Recapture the airfield. It was the kind of assignment officers fought for, not against. In the days before they embarked, the men of the Ichiki detachment had been shown their enemy on paper. A few hundred Marines, the analysts said, perhaps 500. Not a fresh division. Not men with months of jungle fighting behind them. No tanks worth the name. No heavy artillery in position yet. The Americans are improvising, one staff officer said. They have moved faster than we expected, but they are still disorganized. If we strike with enough violence, they will collapse. Strike with enough violence. The phrase fit everything these men believed about their own army and the men in it. Stories from earlier campaigns were passed like rations. A battalion here had overrun a British force 3 times its size. A regiment there had crossed a river in the face of machine gun fire and taken a position thought impregnable. When some reserve lieutenant asked what would happen if the enemy had more guns than expected, a major had shrugged. If they had more guns, he said, we would have heard about them already. Information flowed into that room through a filter. The filter of distance, radio relay, limited reconnaissance, and, most of all, doctrine. The doctrine said that speed and aggression could compensate for gaps in knowledge, that it was better to attack at once with partial information than to wait and risk the enemy digging in. From the Emperor down, the idea that the Americans could match Japanese infantry in close combat was treated as a kind of joke. They were soft, indulgent, undisciplined. They might have factories and fleets, but they did not have the same reverence for sacrifice. In the makeshift camps along the jungle trails leading toward the Ilu, Ichiki's men cleaned their rifles and bayonets and listened to non-commissioned officers talk about the coming fight. Some imagined the Marines as a kind of armed construction crew. Others gave them more credit, but not too much. Nobody pictured an entire Marine division waiting behind a river line that had been surveyed, mapped, and laced with interlocking fields of fire. The Army's own messaging contributed to that blindness. Reports from previous engagements underplayed enemy strengths and emphasized Japanese initiative. Faulty assumptions were rarely admitted. Failure was recast as insufficient zeal. Victory was proof of the existing method. Each time that pattern repeated, it deepened the groove of thought. When word came from higher command that more forces would follow, some officers wondered if it might be wiser to wait for the rest of the regiment, attack with overwhelming power. But the order had an edge of urgency. The airfield was already operational. American aircraft were flying from it, harassing Japanese ships and installations. Every day it remained in American hands tilted the strategic balance. So Ichiki took his orders and wrapped them in his own convictions. His men would move fast, hit hard, and throw these untested Marines back. On the march through the jungle, their belief only grew. They encountered no serious resistance. A few patrol skirmishes, some harassing fire, nothing to suggest an organized line. When they reached the vicinity of the Ilu, scouts reported a wire line, some machine gun positions, but nothing like a continuous trench system. The river itself, shallow and slow, offered an obvious crossing point, a sandbar that would allow men to move quickly under cover of darkness. Once we are across, one company commander said, tracing a line in the dirt. "We turn, roll up their flank, and the airfield is exposed." Another officer asked about American artillery. "Their guns are few," the answer came back. "They have just arrived. Our own ships will support as well." Men who slept that last afternoon before the attack dreamed of a swift battle, of cheering comrades, of flags being raised over captured guns. When they woke, they fixed bayonets and checked their grenades and tightened helmet straps with the muscle memory of a dozen other nights before other attacks. It did not feel reckless. It felt like the continuation of a pattern that had brought them here. On the other side of the river, Al Schmid checked the tension on a machine gun belt and thought about whether the cleaning he'd done that afternoon had been thorough enough. He did not know any of the men moving through the trees across from him. He did not know their names, or their villages, or the slogans painted on the walls of their barracks back home. All he knew, when the flares went up, and the river turned white, and the sandbar filled with bodies that looked like black paper cutouts, was that his gun would either work or it would not. The belief that they could cross that river and smash his line had been forged over years, in training halls and parades and previous victories. It was an entire system's belief. The reality waiting on the far bank had been forged, more quietly, in other places, in factories that never slept, in training camps that turned steelworkers into gunners, in staff meetings that, for once, had counted enemy numbers cautiously instead of optimistically. The revelation would not come in words. It would come in the way a water-cooled machine gun could fire for hour after hour until its barrel glowed, and still not stop. The Browning M1917A1 was not a glamorous weapon. It was heavy. The gun alone weighed over 30 pounds. Add the tripod, the water in the jacket, the ammo boxes, and you ended up with a load that took 3 men and a lot of profanity to wrestle into a gun pit. In training, the instructors hammered that into the heads of men like Al Schmid. You and your crew are not riflemen anymore. You are a system. You move as a unit. You serve a piece of machinery that gives your company its backbone. Before Guadalcanal, Al had learned to think of the gun in those terms. Receiver, barrel, water jacket, feed tray, belt, tripod. Functions, malfunctions, immediate action drills. He listened as sergeants talked about beaten zones and cone of fire, the way bullets from a properly laid machine gun did not just zip in straight lines, but filled a 3-dimensional volume of space at about chest height over hundreds of yards. He didn't love the terminology, but he respected its solidity. It reminded him of the steel shop back home. Machines had a logic. Understand that logic, and you could coax performance out of them. On Guadalcanal, all that education crystallized into something simpler. Diamond's squad had one job on the river line, to see that no enemy force crossed at their sector. Every shovel of dirt they'd thrown to dig in, every reheated can of beans, every miserable hour swatting at insects in the dark had existed in service of that task. On the afternoon before the attack, Diamond made them walk the line again. They studied their fields of fire, 2 machine gun pits covering the sandbar and the bends in the river, with interlocking arcs so that if one went down, the other could still rake the crossing. Rifle pits staggered between them, so that no man stood directly behind another. Pre-sighted stakes driven into the sand, white tops just visible, marked ranges. If the flares failed, those stakes and memorized numbers would tell Schmid and Rivers where to put their fire. "Think in lanes," Diamond said. "That patch between those 2 palms? That's a lane. That dip in the far bank? Lane. Every lane's got a number. You hear me call lane 3200? You know where that is." They practiced commands until they were short and precise. No shouted panic, no wasted words. Diamond would call ranges and lanes. Rivers would adjust the traverse and elevation. Schmid would feed and watch for stoppages. Behind that tiny system were larger ones. At Henderson Field, Seabees and Marines had worked night and day to keep the strip usable, filling bomb craters, grading, dragging wrecks off the edges. That work meant that, even with Japanese ships shelling the place, American aircraft could still launch at dawn and fly cover over the island. Those planes, in turn, lowered the odds that Japanese reinforcements or heavy guns could reach the Ilu in time to help. Offshore, destroyers and cruisers had dueled in the dark, sometimes leaving the Marines ashore isolated for days. But enough ships had gotten through in the first landings to put artillery on the island, 105s and 75s that could reach the river with HE rounds. Behind each of those guns stood men who could turn a map coordinate and a spotting report into steel on target in minutes. Further back still, beyond the horizon, lay a continent-sized machine that had already started to spin up. Factories in places like Pittsburgh and Detroit were retooling to spit out more guns, more shells, more trucks. Men who had never heard of the Ilu River turned bolts on assembly lines that would eventually send spare parts and fresh barrels to forward depots in the Pacific. Ichiki's detachment had its own systems, but they were stretched thin. Their logistics tail was exposed to air attack. Their radios were temperamental. Their assumption had always been that aggressive maneuver would offset those weaknesses. Standing in the gun pit as darkness deepened, Al felt none of that. He was a link in a chain he couldn't see. What he did feel was the reassuring solidity of the Browning when he leaned his weight into the rear pad, the way the spade grips fit his hands, the way the trigger bar lay under his thumbs. "Where'd you work before the Corps, Schmid?" Diamond had asked him once during the long days on the transport. "Steel mill," Al said. "Cutting plate." Diamond had nodded. "Then you know how to stand in one place and make noise for 12 hours. You'll do fine." Now, as the first waves of Japanese soldiers broke from the tree line and began to move toward the water, that experience translated in a different way. Al understood monotony under pressure. He understood a job where everything depended on repeating the same action perfectly, hundreds of times, without letting fatigue or fear make you sloppy. When the orders came down the line that first contact was imminent, there was no stirring speech. Somebody passed the word that artillery was zeroed in on pre-registered points across the river. If the Japanese massed, the guns would work them over before they reached the water. Then the flares went up, and the men across the river started running. At first they came in good order, as if on exercise. Columns broke into line as they neared the sandbar, groups angling toward what they thought were gaps. Officers shouted and waved swords. Bayonets glinted. It was a textbook night assault, the kind Ichiki's staff had planned. The Browning turned it into something else. Rivers rode the gun low, sending long bursts just above knee height, where the beaten zone had been measured to fall. Men running into it stumbled, as if the ground itself had risen to trip them. Those behind crashed into them. The lane disappeared under falling bodies, and men trying to crawl forward over them. The Japanese tried to adjust. Officers screamed for them to spread out, to get across the water quickly, to close with the line where machine guns could not rake them with impunity. Mortars on their side began to plop somewhere back in the trees. A few shells fell short and hissed into the water. Others landed near the marine line, sending sprays of dirt and fragments into the pits. Somewhere along the line, a gun jammed, fell silent. Diamond heard it, recognized the sudden gap in the roaring chorus of automatic fire, and pivoted. "Left lane, 400, he shouted. Rivers shifted the gun, tracers reaching for the newly forming knot of movement where the silence had opened away. Al felt the guns change in rhythm as the traverse ran out of its previous arc and settled into a new groove. The water in the Browning's jacket began to simmer. Steam curled from the filler cap vent. Al could smell hot metal even through the jungle stink. He stole half a second when a Japanese mortar salvo fell well short to glance at the water level. It was low. They'd top it off later if they got the chance. For now, the glowing jacket was a good sign. The gun was doing what it had been built to do. At some point in that first hour, Rivers took a hit. It was almost invisible amid the noise. One moment he was hunched over the gun, mouth open as he sucked air through clenched teeth, eyes tracking the faint silhouettes across the river. The next, his body snapped backward, shoulders slamming into the rear of the pit. His helmet bounced off the revetment. His hand slid off the grips. The Browning fell silent. For an instant, the sudden absence of its thunder felt louder than the mortar blasts. Al didn't think. Training and instinct threw him forward. He slid into River's place, fingers closing around the spade grips as if he'd been measuring his hands against them for this moment all along. "Got it!" he shouted. Diamond, blood on his own sleeve from a fragment wound he hadn't had time to notice, leaned closer, voice hoarse. "Lane 2, 300. Don't ride the trigger. Short bursts. Keep her alive." Al squeezed. The gun answered with a rhythm different from River's. Shorter, more deliberate, but no less lethal. He walked the fire along the stake line they'd memorized, trusting the ghostly markers he could not see in the half-light. He lost track of how many belts they burned through. Cloth sagged, boxes emptied, fresh belts were dragged up from behind by riflemen who crawled through the pit trading their own weapons for the chance to keep the gun talking. Every time the Browning stuttered or hesitated, Al's hands flew through the clearing drill. Cover up, check feed, re-rack, back on target. The revelation for the men across the river came slower. At first they thought the torrent of fire was a temporary thing, a surge to be endured. Their training told them that no one could sustain that volume for long. Guns overheated, ammo ran low. Men flinched, but the guns did not stop. When one faltered, another picked up. When an entire section went quiet under a well-placed mortar round, artillery from the American side began to walk shells through the trees where their officers tried to reorganize. Calls for medics were drowned in the continuous growl of automatic fire and the deep, steady crash of shells. Some Japanese squads managed to reach the water's edge, even step into it. They shouldered rifles and fired blindly toward the muzzle flashes on the far bank. A few Marines in rifle pits went down, cursing and clutching torn flesh. But every little knot of attackers that tried to push past the sandbar found itself scythed down not by individuals, but by patterns laid out in advance. What seemed, from the Japanese side, like a wall of bullets was in fact a complex web of intersecting fields of fire designed by officers who had never seen these men but knew their likely paths. The realization that they had misjudged the enemy did not arrive for Ichiki in a single moment. It came in pieces, reports that companies were pinned, that gaps were illusions, that the Marines had more guns than expected and used them with cold precision. By the time that understanding reached its full shape, he had already lost the ability to change the outcome. Down in the gun pit, the night narrowed and then exploded. The grenade came in from an angle nobody had covered. The Japanese had been trying for hours to neutralize the Browning. Every time they advanced, it cut lanes through them. Some had dragged light machine guns into exposed positions and tried to rake the pit. Others had crawled along the river edge, hoping to throw explosive into that narrow slot of earth. Al never saw the man who threw the grenade. He heard the clink, metal on sand, too close, too wrong, and then Diamond's voice turned into a hoarse shout that didn't sound like a command at all. "Grenade!" In the small world of the gun pit, there was nowhere to go. Al had a flash of time to duck, to turn his head slightly, to try to shield something vital. The next instant the world became white heat and impact. The blast punched him down into the sand, tore the breath out of his lungs. Something hot and jagged traced a path across his face. He felt his left hand go numb from wrist to fingertips. A thunderclap went off inside his skull, and for a few heartbeats he did not know which way was up. When sound came back, it came in pieces. The Browning's roar, still close. Someone grunting through clenched teeth. A high-pitched ringing that might have been his own. The screams across the river remained, but now they were distant, muffled, like they'd been wrapped in cotton. He tried to open his eyes. Nothing happened. For a moment he thought the flare had just gone out again, plunging everything into darkness. But this was different. There were no after-images, no hints of light, no shadows, only a solid, suffocating black that belonged inside his skull, not out in the world. Panic stabbed through his chest, sharp and irrational. He tried again. The same nothing answered him. He felt something thick and warm on his cheeks, dripping from his chin onto his tunic. When he got his good hand up to touch his face, his fingers came away slick. "Diamond!" he choked. I can't see." The gun was still firing. That fact cut through the panic like a hand on his shoulder. Someone, maybe Diamond, maybe another man, had caught the spade grips as Al fell and kept the Browning singing. A hand grabbed his collar and dragged him back from the lip of the pit where he'd slumped. "Schmid!" Diamond's voice rasped close to his ear. There was pain in it, but also command. "Can you hear me?" "Yeah." "You hit bad?" "My eyes." Saying it made it real. "I'm blind, Corporal. I can't see a damn thing." There was steel in Diamond's reply. "You don't need to see. You know this gun. You know these ranges. We're not done here." Someone else cursed as a bullet snapped overhead and slammed into the rear of the pit. The Browning hesitated, spat a few erratic rounds, and then went silent. The sudden absence a familiar threat. Diamond swore again. "Weapons down. Schmid, get back on it." "I just told you I'm blind." "I heard you," Diamond said. "You're still the best hand for that gun. I'll be your eyes. You be the gunner. Now move." Al's world had shrunk to darkness and pain and the feel of wet sand under his palms. Logic said he should be dragged back, taken to some aid station. Logic said blindness was a ticket out of this hole, out of the island, out of the war. But there was a bigger logic in the pit. As long as the Browning stayed silent, that strip of river became a door. He crawled forward, each motion a stab in his ribs and face. His knees found the front of the pit. His hands found the familiar contours of the Browning. He groped for the spade grips, the trigger bar. Blood ran into his mouth, metallic and thick. "What's the malfunction?" he asked, voice steadier than he felt. "Feed's twisted," someone said. "Belt jammed up in the tray." "Clear it," Al said. His fingers went to the feed cover, flipping it up, feeling along the belt with his good hand. The cartridges were misaligned, one jammed crosswise. He pried it loose, straightened the cloth, seated the next round. "Close it." The cover clacked down. He settled in behind the gun. "Where?" he asked. Diamond's hand landed on his shoulder. "Lane 3. 200. They're bunching up near the log on the far bank." Al sighted down instinctively, even though the sight picture was gone. His cheek found the same spot on the stock where it always rested. He wasn't seeing with his eyes anymore. He was seeing with the memory of the stake line, the map in his head. He squeezed the trigger bar. The Browning spoke again. The recoil came back into his shoulder, steady, familiar. He walked the bursts through where Lane 3, 200 yards, had been etched into his mind during those daylight rehearsals. Diamond's voice guided him in short, clipped phrases. "Left, half a man. Good. Hold. Up a hair. New lane, 4, 250. They're trying farther down." Al adjusted elevation by clicks, traversed by feel, trusting the hand on his shoulder to press him a little one way or another when the corrections were too fine to put into words. The world beyond the pit remained an absolute void. There were no muzzle flashes now, no silhouettes, only sound. The screams across the river ebbed and surged. The explosions of friendly artillery walked away into the tree line as fire missions shifted. The Browning's own voice ran like a constant line through all of it, the only thing that did not change. Some part of Al's mind detached from the pain and fear and sank into the old rhythm. Feed, fire, clear. Count out bursts. When the belt ran low, shout for another. Feel the hot metal radiate through the grips and adjust his hold so he didn't burn what skin he still had. Trust that somebody behind him was topping off the water jacket when they could. Time lost its edges. At some point, minutes, an hour later, There was a lull. The enemy's fire slacked. The screams thinned. The only sounds were stray shots and the ragged gasps of Marines in the pits, realizing they were still breathing. "Cease fire!" came a call down the line. Al's thumbs left the trigger bar slowly. The gun clicked to silence. The silence had weight. He sat there for a few seconds, waiting for instructions. None came. The men around him were busy with their own realities, checking ammo, checking wounds, checking that the jungle across the river was truly as quiet as it seemed. "Diamond?" Al said. "I'm here." The corporal sounded older. "Status?" "We held." There was a pause. "You held." Al was about to argue when another voice cut in, someone who'd crawled up behind the pit and was now peering over the rim in the gray light of false dawn. "Jesus," the man whispered. "What do you see?" Diamond asked. The answer came slowly, as if the speaker was forcing each word out through a throat that didn't trust them. "There's bodies, all over the sandbar, and up the bank. Must be, I don't know, 200, more. It's like—" He cut himself off. There were some comparisons that didn't fit any battlefield. Somewhere farther back, officers were starting to talk in more measured tones again, their voices thin in the morning air. They would soon count, measure, estimate. They would write numbers in notebooks, trying to make sense of what had happened here in quantifiable terms. For the moment, in this gun pit, the truth arrived another way. Al sat with his hands still on the gun that had erased those men's chances of crossing. Inside his skull, behind the bandages, he could already feel a corpsman wrapping around his head. There was only blackness. He had not seen the sandbar fill up. He had not seen the men fall. He had felt the belt grow lighter, box after box, hour after hour. He had heard the screams change texture, from confident yells to something ragged and desperate to nothing at all. He did not know yet how permanent the darkness would be. All he knew was that dawn had revealed something the officers on both sides had not expected to see. The Japanese had believed they could cross that river and break the Marines. The Marines had believed that, with the right guns in the right place and the right men behind them, they could hold. Reality had taken those beliefs and laid them out on the sand, where the tide would eventually wash over them. When the counting started, it was clinical. Staff officers moved along the line, notebooks in hand, tallying casualties. Marine dead and wounded were noted with a gravity that had already become habitual this far into the war. Names went into one column, conditions into another. Men like Al were tagged for evacuation as soon as possible. Their usefulness as fighters weighed against their value as living symbols. On the other side of the river, patrols crossed carefully, boots slipping in mud slicked with more than water. They stepped between bodies, turned some over, looked for rank tabs and documents. The first counts were rough, done by eyesight and instinct. More than 200 dead lay in the arc in front of Diamond's and Al's gun. Farther back in the trees, the number climbed. Some, wounded, had crawled only a few yards beyond the killing zone before bleeding out. Others lay where artillery had found them, while they regrouped for a second or third push. When the final estimates were compiled, the staff reports spoke in numbers. Approximately 800 men of the Ichiki detachment had launched the attack. By the time the sun was high enough to turn the river's surface into a strip of blinding light, fewer than a few dozen were unhurt. A handful had escaped back into the jungle. 15 would be taken prisoner. The rest were dead or badly wounded. From a distance, in a later briefing, men around tables would talk about ratios. One battalion of Marines, well dug in, had broken an attacking force roughly equal in size. They would point to the advantages of prepared positions, artillery support, the value of interlocking fields of fire. Some would mention air superiority in the theater, the strategic pressure that had forced the Japanese to attack with only the first echelon of a larger regiment. The mathematics of defeat did not care about courage. It cared about rates of fire, rates of replacement, tonnage moved, barrels worn out and replaced, shells manufactured per week. The Browning and Al's pit had a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Fire disciplined into short bursts pushed that lower, but kept the barrel intact. Multiply that by the number of guns on the line. Add the shells from artillery, the mortars, the rifles. Model the river as a corridor of space any attacking soldier must occupy for a certain number of seconds to cross. Run the numbers. On one side of the equation, 800 men attempting to cross that corridor in waves at night, burdened with rifles, packs, grenades, under orders to press forward regardless of casualties. On the other, enough steel laid through that corridor to pass through every cubic foot of it a dozen times over. Even without perfect aim, the intersection was inevitable. It was not an insult to the dead to say that, given the conditions, the slaughter was a foregone conclusion. It was an admission that, by the time those men stepped off from the trees, the outcome had been largely decided in places they would never see, in staff offices where someone had calculated how many guns and how much ammunition were needed to hold the river, in logistics depots that had ensured those guns were supplied, in factories that had built them strong enough to fire all night without failing. For the Japanese staff officers who had sent Ichiki forward, the numbers looked different. Their charts had underestimated enemy strength. Their assumptions about American will and organization had been wrong. They had believed that a single sharp blow could knock the enemy down at the start of the campaign. Instead, they had fed nearly a battalion of elite infantry into a machine they did not fully understand. Word of the disaster filtered back by radio through fragmentary reports. It took days for Tokyo to grasp the full extent. When they did, they couched it, as all nations did, in phrases that softened edges. An operation had encountered heavy resistance. Units had suffered heavy losses. Plans would be adjusted. But on the ground, looking at the sandbar, there was no abstraction. 200 bodies in front of one gun team became the symbol. It stood in for the whole. In the cold arithmetic of war, that symbol was more than a story of individual heroism. It was a proof-of-concept demonstration of what happened when belief met logistics in a narrow space and lost. Years later, when the island was quiet and carriers moved farther west and new names replaced Guadalcanal in newspaper headlines, the Ilu kept flowing. The river did what rivers do. It carried rainwater and silt to the sea. It erased footprints, softened foxholes, clothed its banks again in green. Tourists in another era would stand on its edge, guided by plaques and markers, and try to imagine the night when tracers stitched across this calm surface, like sewing needles on cloth. For the men who had been there, the legacy was not so easily smoothed over. Al Schmid left the island in a litter, eyes bandaged, the world reduced to the vibration of engines and the murmured voices of corpsmen. He would spend months in hospitals, surgeons working to salvage what they could of his sight. One eye would regain a trace of vision, the other would not. Light and shadow would come back in patches, but never the clear lines of a sandbar under flare light. He was awarded the Navy Cross. Newspapers wrote about him as the blind Marine who had kept firing while wounded. They framed his story as a testament to courage, will, and spirit. For a nation hungry for heroes in a brutal war, his name fit well on posters and in newsreels. Behind those images, his reality was harder. Learning to navigate a world he could no longer see clearly. Learning to accept help for tasks he'd once done easily. Learning to carry the knowledge of what his gun had done without letting it crush him. On the Japanese side, the defeat at the Ilu joined a growing ledger. Each lost detachment, each shattered battalion, each misjudged engagement chipped away at the belief that spirit alone could overcome an enemy with deeper industrial reserves and a growing mastery of combined arms. Officers who survived began to talk, quietly, about the need for better reconnaissance, more respect for enemy capability. Not all listened. Ideologies are slow to admit fault. But the river had written something in numbers that was hard to ignore. The lesson of that night was not that one blind Marine killed 200 men. That is how headlines simplify. The deeper truth was that a system that could turn a steelworker into a gunner, equip him with a reliable weapon, train him in its use, place him in a well-chosen position, and keep him supplied under fire could make individual courage matter more, not less. On a personal level, the story was about a man who, in the worst moment of his life, chose to keep doing his job even when the darkness closed in. On the historical level, it was about how those choices, multiplied by thousands and embedded in structures of planning and production, bent the course of the war. When people stood at the Ilu's edge decades later and looked at the water, they sometimes said it was hard to imagine the violence that had once filled that narrow bend. The river, indifferent, moved on. But for those who knew the story, the image stayed. A man hunched behind a water-cooled gun, eyes bandaged, listening to a sergeant's voice guiding his aim, while on the sand in front of him, the beliefs of an army lay still. In the end, that was the film that played in memory. Not a glorious charge or a flag raising, but a small pit of dirt. A machine built of steel and oil, and a man who could no longer see the world he was changing. The war would move on to other islands, other beaches, other rivers. The lessons stayed where the bodies had fallen. In the narrow space between conviction and reality, the side that understands steel, oil, and time will always have the quieter, heavier voice. It speaks in the morning when the counting is done, and it doesn't care who believed what the night before.